Yeah, that's not supposed to happen. Also, none of the keyboard keys are working. Brilliant. Also, I feel like I've done this joke before. Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Paganitzu, a top-down game which has a mix of both action and puzzle elements, though is definitely more geared to the puzzle side of things. This is actually a sequel to a prior game called Chaganitzu, but I wanted to cover this one and not its predecessor because, quite frankly, there's nothing to see in Chaganitzu which you won't see here. Not to mention Paganitzu is a heck of a lot easier to obtain. Actually, interesting thing about that. Apogee titles commonly showed you the majority of their gameplay and assets in the shareware versions, with the registered games mostly just providing more levels and maybe some new story tidbits. Paganitzu is not one of those games, as all 3 episodes of it, the first shareware episode and the 2 registered episodes, all have very different aesthetics, and even the gameplay mechanics are slightly different between all 3. Because of this, the game never gets boring going all the way from the start of the first episode to the end of the 3rd. However, for everything this game does right, it does have one major issue which can be incredibly frustrating, and we'll get to that one soon enough. Plus, a handful of the levels are just downright evil, since progression through them is based on trial and error instead of logic, which doesn't bode well in a game with limited lives and no continues. Mind you, the addition of mid-level saving and loading completely eliminates the need to have a live system in the first place, so yeah. For as maddening as some of the level design is, the saving and loading system reduces the frustration factor in terms of dealing with it, and isn't nearly as big an issue. Paganitzu was developed by Keith Schuler and published through Apogee in 1991. It's a one-player action/puzzle game with support for both CGA 4-color and EGA 16-color graphics, both running at 320x200 resolution, but only supports the PC speaker for audio. As for its current release date, it's still shareware and easy to obtain simply by going to the 3D Realms storefront at www.3drealms.com and purchasing it for $5. In terms of physical copies, finding full version discs ordered direct from Apogee is probably next to impossible, but there was also a retail release on CD in 1994 by FormGen, which tends to go for between $5 and $10 nowadays. For those of you curious about the game's predecessor, Chaganitzu, it was only available through Softdisk Publishing's Big Blue Disc subscription, and can be found on disc number 44 if you want to go tracking down a legit copy. Again though, the overall gameplay in Chaganitzu is pretty much identical to the first episode of Paganitzu, just with different levels, so I don't recommend trying to track down Chaganitzu unless you're into collecting obscure titles or have an interest in the Big Blue Discs put out by Softdisk. So this game actually has quite the story to it, but I'm going to simplify it as best as I can. You take on the role of Alabama Smith, a blatant analog to Indiana Jones whose repertoire is virtually identical, except Al doesn't seem to carry any weapons around, which seems kind of foolish for someone exploring ancient ruins guarded with traps, but whatever. Basically, the game takes place 3 years after Al's initial adventure in the ancient pyramid of Chaganitzu, and his fame and fortune from said adventures has begun to run dry. Once again wanting to be rich and in the limelight, he ends up learning about Paganitzu, a pyramid 3 times the size of Chaganitzu, said to house 2 magical artifacts, including a crystal rose said to bring peace to its holder, and a silver dagger said to possess the strength of the gods. After doing some helicopter reconnaissance in the area Paganitzu is fabled to be, Al discovers a hill which seems out of place somehow. He lands nearby and digs into the hill, only to quickly discover an entrance into the ancient structure. Al goes inside and once again begins his quest for fame and wealth. Now, before we move on, there's something I want to quickly point out. The story for this game is actually one of the highlights, but you wouldn't know this if all you've seen is the shareware version, which has only small amounts of story compared to the second and third episodes, which really ramp things up, to the point where the ending cutscene of the third episode is, no joke, roughly 16 minutes long. Yeah, most of that is spent reading text, but there's a lot of graphics to go with it as well, including a few animations. But yeah, if you delve into this past the shareware episode, be prepared for quite the story. One of the fastest ways to describe the gameplay in Paganitzu is to compare it to the Adventures of Lolo, an old NES game where you solved puzzles by pushing things around, while collecting heart tokens to open the exit, while avoiding or manipulating the enemies and obstacles around you. Basically, if you know how to play that game, you know how to play this one. You control Al with nothing more than the arrow keys for the most part, though there's also an amulet mechanic in the second episode which uses the spacebar. The goal of each level is to find all of the keys to unlock the exit, then head for the exit, though in the last episode you're challenged to collect all of the gems instead of hunting for keys. The trick, however, is actually getting access to these items without getting killed. For instance, the first episode has snakes which will hypnotize and kill you if they so much as see you, but they're blinded by just about anything, so pushing boulders in front of them or temporarily ignoring certain items in front of them can allow you to pass by without getting attacked. Plus, they can only see sideways, meaning you can get right up next to them from above or below without any issues. There's also spiders which slice you to ribbons if they even remotely touch you, and spike traps which can just gore you in an instant. This may be a good moment to point out that the death sequences in this game are actually pretty violent, complete with copious amounts of blood. A running theme seen in a lot of early shareware titles for reasons I'm still not entirely certain about. Now, it's actually somewhat difficult to give an overall view of how the game plays, since not just the assets but the mechanics change from episode to episode, so I'm going to give a brief rundown of the differences between all three. In the first episode, Romancing the Rose, you're collecting keys while avoiding snakes and spiders, with your main obstacles being boulders and water. The spiders explode into gemstones when trapped, the blast of which can also take out certain things such as boulders and pipes, often providing access to otherwise inaccessible parts of the levels. However, while the first half of the episode is fairly straightforward, the second half is just downright evil, with unique level properties which are almost impossible to guess at without getting killed a bunch just experimenting with it all, including one level which is pitch black until you find a light source all the way in an opposite corner. The second episode, Quest for the Silver Dagger, has Al in an underground area filled with lava. Now, the difference between the lava and water is that when you push boulders onto the water would be removed. If you push a boulder onto the lava, it just dissolves the boulder without providing a means across. There's also levers both you and the enemies can push to toggle flame barriers. Plus, the enemies of choice include salamanders and wraiths, both able to burn you to a crisp just from getting close to them. The wraiths and salamanders have the same wall-following AI as the spiders from the first episode. One important thing to note is that the salamanders can't go backwards. Thus, if they end up running into a dead end, they'll just become stuck. One of the major mechanics of this episode are special amulets you can find and then drop with a spacebar to trigger explosions. You just have to be careful though, as some amulets also release wraiths when they explode. Now, up to this point, there's secret walls you can uncover which can lead to hidden bonuses which award points while providing some funny or useful text. Or sometimes secret walls can simply hinder progress or have jewels or keys hidden within them. To uncover a secret wall, all you have to do is touch what looks like a solid wall and it will disappear. The third episode, Jewel of the Yucatan, has you searching for jewels instead of keys. The secret walls are gone, and a new mechanic has been added in the form of demons and baubles. Demons can either be blank, or can be holding a colored bauble of some sort, with yellow being the exit, green preventing movement against the direction its arrow is pointing in, blue being collectible and used for changing the direction of a green bauble, and red also being collectible and used to remove the purple liquid pooled up in some of the levels. Keeping in mind that you can only carry one bauble at a time because of how large they are. If a demon is not carrying a bauble, they might be pushable, though not always. And if a demon you push ends up touching another demon, they'll both disappear. There's also skeletal lizards and things referred to as neurons. The neurons are like the snakes from the first episode, except they can also see up and down, while the skeletal lizards are similar to the salamanders from the second episode, except they can't hurt you, and you'll typically use them as a moving shield to block you from sight while getting past some of the neurons. Beyond all of that, and given that the frustrating level design can be mitigated with the mid-level saving and loading features, I only have one major complaint about this thing, and that's the controls. To put it simply, this is a game where precise control is the key to survival, but unfortunately the controls are rather unresponsive. Holding a key down works fine, but trying to get in just a single tap often doesn't. So when you need to make 2 taps in different directions, you can end up getting completely screwed up if the first tap fails and the second tap succeeds. I died more times than I can count due to this issue with the controls, and it's the only major issue present, as for the most part, everything else works well enough. Overall, Paganitzu is a challenging and well-varied game, which would be completely unfair if it didn't have mid-level saving and loading. If not for the unresponsive controls, I'd call it a must-play classic, but as it stands, I'm going to recommend you actually be into this style of action puzzle gameplay if you're going to give it a shot. Otherwise, the thing's just going to seriously frustrate you before you even get halfway through the first episode. In terms of DOSBox settings, all you have to do is leave cycles set to auto and you should be good to go. Don't set cycles to max, as this will cause the animations and text to go by way too fast. Also, if you intend to use a joystick or gamepad, I recommend skipping on the game's internal support and using DOSBox's key mapper to map keyboard keys to your joystick or gamepad of choice. The reason for this is because the game's internal joystick support is ultra sensitive, making it extremely difficult to perform vertical movement when using an analog stick, as well as causing the cursor to move insanely fast in the menus. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 179 will be on Saturday, February 6th, and we'll be taking a look at another tile-based game played from a top-down perspective, except unlike today's game, which was more of a puzzle game, this one's more of an action game, which looks like a dungeon crawl at first glance, but it's kinda not. If you think you know which game this might be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned as we continue our little side trek through the simpler and often forgotten games of the DOS era.